In the early 1980s, a Tennessee photographer with no formal gunsmithing training whatsoever was photographing a river patrol boat when he noticed something in one of his own pictures. A .50 caliber Browning machine gun mounted prominently on the boat's own deck, the exact same weapon and the exact same cartridge this channel has already covered as America's own century-old machine gun that nobody could ever quite manage to replace, despite 3 separate serious attempts. Ronnie Barrett had a genuinely simple realization looking at that photograph, one that struck him with enough force that he could not simply let it go once the idea had actually taken hold. Nobody had ever actually built a rifle a single soldier could shoulder and fire, chambered for that same devastatingly powerful cartridge, already proven reliable across decades of continuous military service, in a considerably heavier weapon. So he decided to build one himself, with no formal training and no established company behind him. This is the story of the Barrett M82, the rifle American forces now call a tank killer, the photographer with zero formal weapons training who actually designed it from nothing more than a single photograph and a genuine mechanical curiosity, and the honest truth about exactly what this weapon can and cannot actually destroy in real combat conditions. Every week, we take apart the story stamped on the receiver of an American firearm, the designers, the soldiers, and the decisions that built a legend or lost one. Subscribe if that is the kind of history you want more of. Barrett founded his own company for a single, remarkably narrow purpose: building a genuinely usable semi-automatic rifle chambered for the .50 BMG cartridge. The same 12.7mm round Winchester had originally developed decades earlier, specifically to feed John Browning's own M2 heavy machine gun during the final years of the First World War. Nobody had seriously attempted putting that same cartridge into a rifle a single soldier could actually carry and fire from his own shoulder, since the round's own considerable recoil and raw power had always seemed to demand a vehicle mount or a tripod rather than anything resembling ordinary infantry equipment any single soldier might realistically operate alone. Barrett worked without any formal engineering background, teaching himself the specific mechanical challenges involved through direct trial and error rather than any conventional gunsmithing education most firearms designers of his own era actually possessed, and the first working examples of what he eventually designated the M82, named simply for the year he actually finished it, reached the market in 1982. Before we get into exactly how a weapon nobody in the military initially wanted became standard issue within less than a decade, if you are finding this useful, hit subscribe. It costs nothing and it helps the channel keep telling these stories. Early sales proved genuinely modest, and Barrett spent the following several years refining the original design into the considerably improved M82A1, introduced in 1986, with meaningful upgrades to reliability and handling that the original 1982 version had never quite achieved, despite genuine early interest from a small number of civilian and professional buyers. The rifle's own first real military customer was, somewhat surprisingly, not the United States at all, but Sweden, whose own army purchased roughly 100 examples in 1989, a modest but genuinely significant vote of confidence from a foreign military that had evaluated the weapon on its own individual merits rather than any existing American service relationship or established defense contracting arrangement that might otherwise have influenced the decision. The rifle's own actual breakthrough arrived with the Gulf War in 1990, when the United States Marine Corps purchased approximately 125 examples for Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm, followed quickly by additional orders from the Army and Air Force once the weapon's own genuine battlefield utility became clear during actual combat operations across the desert terrain of Kuwait and Iraq. The wide-open desert terrain of that specific conflict happened to suit the rifle's own particular strengths almost perfectly: long, unobstructed sight lines, letting American forces actually exploit the weapon's own considerable effective range against enemy vehicles and equipment positioned well beyond what any conventional infantry rifle could realistically engage. The American military designated its own version the Special Applications Scoped Rifle, later standardizing the weapon more formally as the M107, adopted specifically for anti-materiel work, engaging targets like parked aircraft, radar installations, unarmored vehicles, and equipment rather than enemy soldiers directly, alongside a genuinely practical secondary role in explosive ordnance disposal, where the rifle's own considerable range and power let technicians safely detonate unexploded devices from a genuinely survivable distance rather than approaching dangerously close on foot. Here is where the popular nickname actually deserves some honest scrutiny rather than simply accepting the more dramatic version of the story at face value. The M82 can genuinely defeat light armor, unarmored trucks, parked aircraft, radar cabins, and similar equipment at ranges exceeding a mile, a real and considerable capability that fully justifies the weapon's own formal anti-materiel classification and its own documented effectiveness against exactly these kinds of targets across multiple separate conflicts. What it cannot actually do, despite the dramatic tank killer nickname that has attached itself to the weapon in popular culture and casual conversation alike, is reliably penetrate the actual frontal armor of a genuine modern main battle tank, armor specifically engineered across decades of separate military development to withstand considerably more powerful anti-tank weapons than a single rifle round, however impressively powerful that round might genuinely be compared to an ordinary infantry rifle cartridge firing a conventional bullet. The nickname reflects the weapon's own real effectiveness against lighter armored vehicles, unarmored equipment, and considerably softer targets a battlefield actually contains in genuinely large numbers, not literal documented combat kills, against a fully armored main battle tank's own actual frontal protection, a distinction worth actually understanding rather than simply repeating the more cinematic version of the story that has attached itself to the weapon over decades of popular media coverage and casual online discussion. The rifle has since seen genuine combat service across a genuinely remarkable range of conflicts for a weapon originally built essentially as one photographer's personal side project rather than any formal government development program. Deployed during the Soviet-Afghan War, the Kosovo conflict, the war in Afghanistan following the September 11th attacks, the Iraq War, and numerous other engagements stretching from the late 1980s into the present day, including recent documented use in the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, alongside considerably less official use by irregular forces, insurgent groups, and criminal organizations that have acquired the weapon through various channels entirely outside any legitimate military supply chain, a proliferation pattern common to many genuinely effective weapons once they have actually demonstrated their own real-world battlefield value beyond any single nation's own original military customer base. Australian, British, and numerous other allied special operations forces have adopted variants of the design as well, a genuinely international reputation for a rifle whose own original design work took place in a single American workshop with essentially no formal institutional backing behind it at all during those crucial early development years. The rifle's own technical design solved a genuinely difficult engineering problem few observers outside the firearms industry fully appreciate, taming the .50 BMG cartridge's own tremendous recoil enough that an ordinary soldier could actually fire the weapon repeatedly from a standing or prone position without sustaining injury or losing the ability to accurately place a follow-up shot. Barrett's own solution centered on a recoil-operated action combined with a genuinely substantial muzzle brake, a device that vents propellant gas sideways and rearward specifically to counteract much of the rifle's own rearward recoil energy before it ever actually reaches the shooter's own shoulder, a mechanical compromise that also makes the weapon considerably louder and more visible when fired, venting a genuinely dramatic muzzle blast and dust cloud that can, in certain tactical situations, actually reveal a shooter's own firing position to nearby enemy forces. The rifle's own semi-automatic action represented a further genuine departure from earlier heavy-caliber sniping attempts, which had generally relied on the same M2 Browning machine gun soldiers had already been improvising scoped mounts onto since Vietnam, since a dedicated semi-automatic rifle let a single shooter engage multiple separate targets in rapid succession without needing to manually cycle a bolt between every single shot, the way a bolt-action alternative would have required. The cartridge itself deserves its own share of credit for the weapon's own genuine battlefield effectiveness, since the .50 BMG round Barrett actually built his rifle around carries roughly 5 times the kinetic energy of a standard NATO rifle cartridge at typical combat ranges, an enormous difference in raw destructive potential that explains both the weapon's own genuine anti-materiel capability and its own equally genuine limitations against heavier armor. That same cartridge's own well-established, decades-long production history, already proven reliable across an entire century of continuous American machine gun service by the time Barrett actually began his own rifle project, meant he never had to solve an ammunition problem alongside his own mechanical engineering challenge, an advantage considerably more significant than it might initially appear given how many other experimental heavy rifle projects across the same era actually failed specifically because their own designers had to develop an entirely new, unproven cartridge alongside an unproven weapon simultaneously. Special Operations Forces found genuine, specialized applications for the rifle beyond conventional anti-materiel work as well, using its own considerable range and accuracy for extended distance anti-personnel engagements in specific tactical situations where a standard sniper rifle's own more modest range simply could not reach an intended target, despite the weapon's own official anti-materiel classification technically emphasizing equipment and vehicles over enemy soldiers directly. Documented engagements at ranges exceeding a mile have been reported across multiple, separate conflicts, distances that would have been considered essentially impossible for any single shooter using a conventional sniper rifle chambered in a standard rifle cartridge, a genuine tactical capability that expanded what military planners actually considered achievable for a single soldier operating alone or in a small team, rather than requiring artillery or air support to engage a target at comparable range. This is not a story about a weapon built by a career military engineer working through a formal government procurement program. The way most of the weapons this channel has already documented actually came into existence through established institutional channels. It is a story about a single photographer who noticed a genuine gap in what existing weapons could actually do, taught himself the mechanical problem well enough to solve it personally, and built a rifle that went from a modest civilian curiosity to standard military issue within less than a decade, armed with nothing more than a real observation and the persistence to actually follow through on it. The design itself continued evolving well beyond Barrett's own original 1982 blueprint. The modern M107A1 variant, incorporating a titanium receiver and an updated muzzle brake specifically designed to accept a suppressor, changes that reduce the weapon's own overall weight while addressing exactly the kind of muzzle blast and visible signature concerns that had made the original design considerably easier for enemy forces to detect and locate once a shooter had actually fired. That continued refinement across 4 full decades of ongoing production reflects a genuinely rare achievement in modern firearms design, a platform still receiving meaningful engineering updates and remaining an active frontline military service more than 40 years after a single self-taught photographer first built a working prototype essentially alone, without the institutional resources or accumulated engineering knowledge base a major established defense contractor would ordinarily have brought to a comparable weapons development program from the very beginning. Barrett's own company grew considerably beyond that single, original rifle design across the following decades, eventually producing multiple additional variants, including bolt-action alternatives and a bullpup configuration. While the civilian market for the same basic .50 caliber rifle platform expanded into genuine, long-range precision shooting competitions that did not exist in anything resembling their current form when Barrett himself first began his own development work in the early 1980s. Competitive long-range shooting organizations eventually built entire match categories specifically around rifles chambered for the .50 BMG cartridge, a sport that arguably would never have developed at the scale it eventually reached without Barrett's own original semi-automatic design first demonstrating that an ordinary shooter, not simply a specialized military crew, could actually manage the cartridge's own considerable recoil and complexity in a shoulder-fired platform. That civilian sporting legacy runs in an entirely separate track alongside the rifle's own military service record, a genuine dual identity few other firearms designs from any era have actually managed to sustain simultaneously at such a high level of genuine achievement in both categories. The explosive ordnance disposal role deserves its own genuine recognition alongside the weapon's own more widely publicized combat applications, since it represents a genuinely humanitarian use for a rifle otherwise associated almost entirely with destruction. Technicians tasked with safely neutralizing unexploded ordnance found in the rifle's own considerable range and stopping power a genuinely practical way to detonate dangerous devices from a distance that kept the technician's own body safely outside the resulting blast radius, a role that has likely saved considerably more lives among the technicians actually using the weapon than most casual observers familiar only with its own combat reputation would ever assume, given how thoroughly the tank killer nickname has come to dominate the weapon's own popular image over its own considerably quieter humanitarian applications. Tennessee formally named the Barrett rifle its own official state rifle, a genuine honor for a design that began with an amateur gunsmith's own personal curiosity rather than any government contract or established manufacturer's own product development program. If you want more stories about the weapons built by people nobody expected to build them, subscribe and we will keep finding them for you. See you in the next one.